us with the space to discuss G20 developments at this time. We are excited to delve into the details of the first G20 foreign ministers meeting in Rio de Janeiro under the Brazilian presidency, along with Bruna Santos, director of the Brazil Institute, and Lourival Sant'Anna, CNN Brazil political analyst. This week, G20 foreign ministers have convened in Rio de Janeiro to deliberate on pressing global issues such as poverty, climate change, and conflicts. Brazil has positioned the reform of the United Nations at the center of its G20 presidency. During this two-day meetings, Brazil called for reforms of the United Nations and other multilateral institutions, advocating for a strong representation of the developing countries. Brazilian Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira defended a profound reform of global governance. In parallel, the Brazilian government engaged in a marathon of bilateral meetings, including a session between President Lula and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Brasilia. Blinken visited Brazil for the first time this week ahead of this G20 talks. So we have a lot to discuss in a very short time. So I hope we can manage time right here and go direct to the point. So I would like to start with Bruna, who is currently in Rio de Janeiro. So Bruna, what are the main takeaways from this meeting?
Thank you, Luisa. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for your great summary at the beginning. You just made my job much easier, and Lourival as well. You made a great apanhado, a great summary of everything that happened. Lourival, thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you. Well, I think, we all know that this is an important moment for Brazil. It's an important moment for Brazil to expand its global footprint, serving as G20 president and preparing to host the 2025 UN Climate Change Conference. But honestly, I think that the Israel controversy has somewhat eclipsed the significance of the foreign ministers meeting in Rio, which it's a pity, to be very honest. I think that the fact that we are all talking and thinking about Antony Blinken's candid admission of the real disagreement that happened between the US and Brazil regarding the conflict is important. But also, I think that the Lula's endeavor to position Brazil as a vanguard of the Global South, as a leader of the Global South, which was highlighted by the visit and the remarks that he made in Africa just a week ago, and the fact that it all became somehow eclipsed in these meetings, I think it's an important matter for us to consider, and I think it's the main challenge for Brazil moving forward. As you said, I think the agreement, and the second day was pretty much focused on that, the second day of the meetings, the agreement that everyone there in the meeting agreed that we need, it's urgent to move forward with reforms within the multilateral organizations. I think it's one important political also remark of the group. The fact that there was consensus around it is an important remark. Also, I'd say one thing that I honestly missed from as an outcome from this meeting was the focus on the task force for a global alliance against hunger and poverty. Lula has stated in the past, when he launched the priorities for G20, Brazil's presidency, he mentioned several times that he wanted this global alliance to be Brazil's legacy for G20, and I think that completely disappeared from in the conversation. Blinken, before traveling, had mentioned that he wanted to also bring showcase the U.S. leadership in this area through USAID in Africa and all the efforts that are made to create a more sustainable and resilience resilient agriculture in the world to fight hunger. I think that it was all eclipsed due to the remarks that Lula made about Israel and Gaza. In Gaza. So I think that I think that it highlights the balancing act that Lula has ahead of him, and that Brazil's diplomatic delegates have ahead of them, which is a balancing act that we all know that it's a part of the strategy, but we all know that the strategy can be undermined by ideological forces. And that's an important matter for us to observe moving forward.
Well, the meeting happened in a very busy week for foreign policy, just ahead of the third veto of the U.S. in the UN in the Security Council for a ceasefire, and reports talk about isolated the U.S. and this G20 foreign minister meeting. But Lourival, have you also you have also been following this meeting from Brazil, and I want to hear how do you see it, and what have you observed on the ground, and what insights have you gained from conversations with delegates?
Sure. I'm very glad to be here with my former colleague at CNN Brazil, Luiz, when she was a New York correspondent, and also with Bruna, who is my source. I've interviewed her several times about U.S.-Brazil relations. Now, on the preparation for this year of G20 meetings here in Brazil, the summit will be in November. The Brazilian officials, they had said that they intended to avoid the Ukraine war, or the war on Ukraine, to be on the top of the agenda for these meetings. Then came the Gaza war, and still Brazil intended, or said they intended, to focus the conversation on the global governance reform, on the climate change, and on the fight against poverty and inequality. However, President Lula himself drove the attention to the Israeli campaign on Gaza when he compared it with what, as he said, Adolf Hitler's actions. Well, in the meeting between Antony Blinken and President Lula, which was 1 hour and 50 minutes long, the day before the start of the G20 foreign ministers meeting, this issue was addressed, and Antony Blinken's stepfather is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was 12 years old when the Nazi soldiers arrived at his family home in Poland and killed all his stepfather's relatives, and his stepfather was able to flee. And they addressed this, but of course, for 1 hour and 50 minutes meeting, this in itself shows that there are many others, or there are many issues in the agenda between the U.S. and Brazil. And I know that I understand that the meeting was very cordial and very pragmatic, as Antony Blinken used to behave, to conduct his meetings and his dealings. And the next day, already on the first day of the G20 meeting, President Lula received Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov for 1 hour, a 1 hour meeting. And President Lula confirmed that he is going to take part in the BRICS summit in October in Russia, which means that Brazil will not work in a way that Russia becomes an international pariah, or Brazil will continue legitimating Vladimir Putin's regime in the context of the BRICS at least. And in fact, Brazil had said that that this meeting would be about climate change, poverty, and global governance. But then in the opening speech by Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira, the focus was almost totally on global governance reform. And one becomes suspicious about this when the US and Russia both agree on something which has geopolitical consequences. If Russia and the US are supporting this, as they said they are, this means that this probably has no geopolitical consequences given the totally divergent goals and interests of these two powers. By the way, the European Union also, Josep Borrell also said that they support this agenda. So what does this mean? Brazil, when President Lula talks about this, he includes not only the expansion of the Security Council, but also changes in the governance of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and even the World Trade Organization, which, by the way, for many years now lacks the judge, the panel for appeals, which is the teeth of the WTO, because the United States, since Barack Obama's government refuses to approve the appointment of these judges. So the WTO is dysfunctional. And so all these changes would be to reflect the new balance of economic and political power in the world after the post-Second World War period. But for Brazil knows that in order to expand the Security Council, this would probably mean to eliminate the veto power. Because if you are going to bring other countries with veto powers, this would mean a huge concession by Russia, China, the US, Britain, and France, which nowadays are the 5 ones which hold this veto power. On the other hand, if you eliminate the veto power, this would also be a power concession. And as you know, nations don't give up power for nothing. And this is a huge concession. So my feeling, and I may be wrong, but my feeling is that this is going nowhere. This is just talking and just, just a way for the US to put pressure on Russia and China, and also for Russia and China to have a good approach to look like they are making some concession to Brazil, but they are not. By the way, India and Japan are candidates for permanent seats in the Security Council, and both are adversaries of China. So China would not accept this. Therefore, Brazil has been making concrete concessions in exchange for statements in favor of this expansion. For instance, China brought several countries into BRICS against Brazil's interest. We are talking about Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Argentina. Brazil wanted only Argentina to come in, and that was during the previous government. Nowadays, even Argentina doesn't want to be in the BRICS anymore. And Brazil accepted that in exchange for a promise of supporting the expansion of the Security Council. So as I say, a consequential concession in the BRICS context in exchange for something that is not going to happen. So this is dominating the Brazilian foreign policy. It is an very old claim by Brazil. This comes from the 90s, when the US started proposing this because they wanted Germany and Japan to play a bigger role to support financially the actions of the United Nations in the context of the Balkans wars and the Somalia crisis. But then when the third world countries started saying, raising their hands and saying, we want to go as well, then the US lost interest for this agenda. And now it came back because of the war on Ukraine, in a way to try to delegitimate Russia, the presence of Russia in the Security Council, but doesn't go further than that, in my view.
Well, well said. We know that there are a lot of countries agreeing that a reform is needed, but there is no real agreement about what the reform will look like. There are several proposals being presented over the years, and is even not clear what proposal Brazil would favor in the case of a concrete reform. Brazil spoke about supporting an end of veto, for example, as a concrete transformation in the power dynamics in the Security Council right now. But much more debate will be needed to understand what the reform would look like for real if it ever happened. There is an exceptional second G20 foreign minister meeting expected to take place in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. That will be a first time. All countries that are members of the UN, not only the G20 members, are invited to participate also a first time. And so they're really making very clear that Brazil will push for debate and intend to spearhead this process around the reform. And Bruna, do you see a concrete path for overhaul?
No, and I think that building on what Lourival just said, I think my main question would be, did the Brazilian government expect any concrete reform or any outcome from that from the G20 this year? So by choosing to focus on that in the first chancellor's meeting, I think that might be a mistake in terms of, okay, maybe if you focus on hunger and climate change, you would have more concrete results to show and more maybe even legitimacy to talk about and to position itself as a leader within the Global South group. Another thing that I want to just point out, which is I think is important, is this G20 meeting and every controversy that happened about with the Israeli government, and it all happened in the middle of investigations that are happening in Brazil about Bolsonaro, and also a forthcoming demonstration in support of the former president on Sunday. I think it's supposed to happen. Also, the possibility of having Lula, by doing that, is stirring the pot and generating even more animosity among the evangelical groups towards the government. So there are a number of, I think, unintentional consequences that came out of all this week of foreign policy focus on Brazil's landscape that may have consequences next week when we are looking at the local politics. About what you just mentioned, Luiz, I think that we should take into consideration like the evolving nature of G20 and how much it has changed the significance of the host country and its leadership in shaping the G20 summit, and how it has becoming more pronounced, and the focus of delivering of G20 delivering more, I'd say, collective benefits is somehow diminishing, and there is a greater emphasis now in the individual contributions of the presiding country and its leaders. So I think that's one thing that we should take into consideration. Also, the perspective and the perspective that all those like Western dominated leadership forums like the G7 can change into something, into the G20 and becoming the G20 becoming a more fluid and a more important forum for those negotiations. I think that's a transition that is noteworthy. And despite the challenge, I think the elevation of the G20 as a premier forum or as a place where significant developing and developed countries can sit and discuss, it's an important element for us to look at. I think that the inclusion of having Brazil right after India and then leading to South Africa as a leader is gives an important message, and also for us to understand how those countries are behaving in the world today. I think for Brazil, the perception is clear, and I always say that the perception is that we are living in a very unstable global order, where Brazil sees the competition between US and China, or as even some of my colleagues would call this new form of Cold War between US and China, as a competition happening between two very fragile superpowers. On one hand, on one side, you have China with its economic weakness becoming more and more clear, which may lead to social and potentially political implications. And on the other hand, Brazil sees sees the US with its own sort of democratic and institutional weakness. So countries like Brazil, India and South Africa, which we are seeing throughout their leadership in the G20, is they're all managing risk, they're all hedging and waiting, and especially not drawing any conclusions until the US coming election. So that's for me very clear. And really, when you look at the BRICS and we look at, are these countries maybe led by China trying to come up with a new alternate world order? Well, not really. Many of the aspects of this global order, as Lourival just pointed out, is already benefiting China. So these countries are somehow creating, I think Brazil is was very clear that in Africa, when declaring that they wanted to forgive a big part of Africans' debt and work for that, and the role that the BRICS Bank would have in the continent. I think they want to create this alternate set of organizations, of mechanisms, of quasi-alliances, of financial instruments, technological instruments that may give those countries a more fluid and ready to access possibility to opt out the US shade. So as we move forward and we analyze Brazil's leadership, I think the main challenge is how can these tensions that we see with whether or not Lavrov is coming, whether or not Putin is coming in November, how it may maybe steal the focus from other agendas, is the way I think what Brazil needs to decide moving forward. If we look at India, for example, and we saw a more risk-averse approach in terms of the leadership of the G20. I think Brazil has demonstrated that no, it's not taking any risk-averse position. It's maybe a very high-stake summit for Brazil that may or may not fall into like mistakes that may not be positive, especially looking at what would be Lula's third government legacy.
It's double down in this position of global South leadership, with announcing an expected second foreign affairs meeting out of the country, out of the hosting country, out of Brazil, in the UN, in the sidelines of the UN. with the main agenda, the reform of the UN itself. So I would, Lourival, what do you think about that? Do you think this is like a bold leadership, or not really a good idea?
Well, I can understand the Lula's foreign policies only through these lenses of his ambition to project himself as a leader of the global South. It's not understandable without that prism, because President Lula has tried to embrace all the causes, all the agendas of the underdeveloped or developing nations, especially in Africa, but also in, at least from the left-wing point of view, in Latin America and parts of Asia. This is an old ambition of his. In his previous 2 terms, he was also projecting himself that way. But Brazil was in another moment. There was the commodities super boom, and Brazil was full of cash, of dollars. And nowadays it's different. But he spent more than 500 days in jail for alleged corruption schemes, and he came back from jail visibly resentful and really doubling down on his personal ambitions and trying to build a legacy now that he is in his 70s, and really not only to clean his name, but also to project his name as a global leader. And this ambition has endangered Brazil's natural leadership in South America, because last year when President Lula invited for a summit, a South American summit in Brasilia, the previous day, the day before the summit, he received Nicolás Maduro, Venezuelan dictator, as a kind of a hero and as a kind of a great leader. And he made statements saying that these concepts of democracy and dictatorship are relative, and that Venezuela should not be considered as an authoritarian regime. And this puts a lot of strain on the democratic leaders of South America, and even the left-wing president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, and the right-wing president of Uruguay, Lacalle Pou, both condemned these statements and these attitudes by President Lula. And the other ones were silent, but were visibly embarrassed by President Lula's support for the Venezuelan regime. So Brazil is a medium regional power, and it has the possibility, the ability to exercise leadership in South America and maybe Latin America, but not further than that. It's for the global powers to have a sway in global issues. And President Lula is trying to project himself much further than that to the global South, and that's why he has been attacking the dollar dominance, the sanctions against Russia, the Israeli campaign against Gaza, and poverty, and the need for funding from the rich countries to the poor countries for climate change mitigation and all these things. I'm not saying that he doesn't believe these things. I'm sure he does, but he is doing that in an aggressive way, which can only be explained by his ambitions. And by doing that, he is sidelining other priorities, which are very important for Brazil, as for instance, defending democracy, which is consistent with the values of our society. Brazilian democracies went through a stress test a year ago when Bolsonaro's supporters attacked the buildings, invaded and attacked and burned down the buildings of the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the presidential palace, trying to revert Bolsonaro's defeat to Lula. So this would create some opportunity for more convergence with President Biden's agenda, which has gone through more or less the same shock. And this has happened in terms of their brief meeting last year, but it has not developed very long, because President Lula has this priority geared to his alignment with the Global South, and especially in the BRICS context with China and Russia. So this is creating a huge lack of consistency in terms of values, of principles, of the defense of the international order. He is aligning himself with revisionists of the international order, led by the West, and especially by the US, without being able to elaborate, to build up a cohesive proposal for a new order, which would be based on democracy, on the rule of law, and all this, because he is supporting dictatorships in order to be supported by them. So I think this is really creating huge problems for Brazil's foreign policy. And you get to see that, by the way, that Itamaraty, the foreign relations ministry, tries to accommodate, with all its tradition of coherence and trying to accommodate Lula's positions, which is really impossible to do.
Yeah, can I just jump in on that? There's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance sometimes, I think, when we look at those things. Like recently when Lula said that Brazil would wait for investigations to have a position about Nalvani's assassination. It's like, come on, we all know that there is no investigation happening about it. Well, why can't, so there's this, I think that's when I say that all this non-alignment samba and all the political ability that Lula has to don't burn bridges with Maduro, don't burn bridges with Russia, there is a point where you have to have a position, otherwise your positions will no longer be respected. Like saying you're going to wait for investigations in Russia is like ignoring the very nature of the Russian regime. So it sounds, I don't know if naive or just like it becomes impossible to take it seriously moving forward. And as Lourival said, it's gonna sideline all the climate change agenda, all the fighting hunger agenda, which is where Lula's strength is, and where he has a legacy and something to show based on his results, concrete results in the country.
But do you also see a very strong guidance in the foreign policy by Lula's personal ambition and intent of leave behind a legacy? Do you see a presidential diplomacy component in the choices that are being made in this, at least in the Lula tree? government?
Me, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, I think it's an element like, and especially his strengths as a president, as a leader, as a global leader, is much bigger than anything. We didn't expect anything from Bolsonaro's remark last year, in the past 4 years. Now there are expectations towards Lula leadership that's much higher. So the possibility of frustration is bigger. But at the same time, I think that Brazil has an Brazil's international policies go beyond Itamaraty. We are no longer only talking about elements of foreign policy and what comes from diplomats and seasoned diplomats and all that tradition. We have elements of Brazil's foreign policy coming from economy, from the Ministry of Environment, and interests coming from all those ministries. So the Brazil's international insertion is much more complex now than it was when Lula was president at first, and when Celso Amorim was minister at first. He was calling the shots from the Itamaraty, and maybe that strength is no longer that inside of Itamaraty anymore, of the foreign policy ministers.
Well, there's another, we can maybe go back to the tense question, to the more tense question. I was afraid that this might hijack the debate about the G20 foreign minister meeting, but of course we cannot ignore that during the same week, this week, a diplomatic crisis unfolded between Brazil and Israel, and Brazil recalled its ambassador to Israel, Frederico Mayer. So now we have no ambassador in Israel at the moment, and Israel declared that Brazilian President Lula is not welcome in the country. This diplomatic brief began after Lula, attending the African Union summit in Ethiopia, compared the Israel military campaign in Gaza to the Holocaust. How has this development impacted the G20 meeting in Brazil, where 45 delegations gathered this week? And what effects has it had on the G20 agenda, which was, of course, also set to discuss the ongoing Gaza-Israel conflict? I don't know who wants to answer just one first. I guess maybe Lourival.
Sure, if I may. This episode is a proof for what we are saying about how Lula's personal ambitions ran over the traditional and cohesive and consistent foreign policy tradition of Brazil's foreign ministry. That statement comparing Adolf Hitler's actions with Israel's campaign on Gaza was given in a press conference after his speech, his read speech, his Itamaraty prepared speech at the meeting of the African Union in Addis Ababa. And the previous day, he had also read Itamaraty prepared speech at Cairo's at the Arab League summit in Cairo, Egypt, in which he had called the Israeli campaign disproportionate and undiscriminate. Those adjectives are the ones that I use for this campaign. I also think that it's undiscriminate and disproportional because it is a response to a terrorist attack, which was really shocking, by Hamas, but it is targeting the civilians, the infrastructure of Gaza. I'm not saying that it is an easy task to try and neutralize Hamas, because they do use the civilian population of Gaza Strip, where I've been 4 times covering wars there, as a human shield. This is true. However, if you are a state, a member of the United Nations, you are not supposed to behave just like a terrorist group. You have to follow rules because you have a seat at the major multilateral fora. And so you have responsibilities, not only rights. And I'm not saying it would be easy militarily, but Israel would have to, and I know the Israeli Defense Forces are able to circumvent that challenge and make a more chirurgical military operation and more effective, by the way, in terms of rescuing the Israeli hostages and of knocking down Hamas combat force. Now, turning back to Lula. So he said that in the heat of a question and in which he started condemning the suspension of humanitarian aid to the Refugees Agency, Palestinian Refugees Agency of the United Nations by the US and the European Union, because 12 from the 13,000 workers at UNRWA were found by Israel to have taken part in the terrorist attack. And I also agree with that. I don't think it's fair to abandon 2 million people to hunger and to all kinds of sufferings. They depend on the UNRWA's action. So that far, he was fine. Lula was consistent with Brazil's traditions. But then he stepped away from the prepared speech, and he said what was in his heart in a very exaggerated and disproportional and undiscriminated way, just like Israel. So this has to do with this feeling that he has a kind of a moral superiority, that he's a I don't know, a defender of the moral principles, even above the rules of diplomacy and even above the proportional of things. So that's, I think it has to do with his emotional frame of mind, his mindset nowadays. And so, having said that, I think that Lula will be more and more unpredictable as he reacts to all the condemnation, the criticism he has been a target of. I know that he has, I was told by one of his aides that he has been complaining to the people he talks to other leaders from other countries, that he has been too much criticized by the press, so this affects him, and he may even become more and more aggressive, not the opposite. So we are not going to see a more coherent presidential diplomacy in the next few years.
Well,
and I think that oh, sorry.
No, I was about to ask
you,
but just to add that there was controversy over whether the comments were planned or improvised, and or if it was really tailored to you exerting pressure on Israel in a very strategic week, and just before or in face of a threat of invasion of a ground operation in Rafah. And of course, want to hear what Bruna has to say on this matter.
I think that one thing that, and I mentioned that the results that the backlash with Bolsonaro based about what the Lula's remarks. So I think internal politics have a role here as well. When you look at, for example, the group that supported Lula on social media and was like claiming about what a hero he was because of what he said, the way that group was framing it was very similar to how they would frame certain remarks as controversial remarks that former President Bolsonaro did. So, and also when you look in Brazil, the two poles, like the Bolsonaro versus extremely pro-Israel, and the Lula left, extreme left base is also on the other side against Israel on the conflict. So I think that specific matter is a matter, and probably Lourival can correct me if I'm wrong, but it follows exactly the same polarization that we see in Brazil in terms of politics. It's the one of, I don't know if Ukraine and Russia follows the same pattern. I don't think so. But in the case of Israel, it follows the same pattern. So by saying that, Lula is also speaking to his constituents. And that has stirred the pot in a way that I haven't seen in the recent history of Brazil, in terms of seeing the ideology and the polarization so clearly reflected in foreign policy, because of exactly what we were talking about before, the tradition, the way that things were the priorities were defined, and the role that President Lula and his diplomats had in the past maybe have changed more recently due to this, not only to polarization that's obviously much higher, but also to the fact that Brazil's international insertion is going far beyond the foreign policy itself, but it touches on other agendas. But for me, the fact that they considered expelling the ambassador as a move, for me, is a signal of a severe breakdown of a diplomatic tradition. So it's I think that we see now, especially on this matter, moments when ideology is having a very pervasive influence in foreign policy in certain moments in Brazil. Obviously, I cannot say if it was improvised or not. I will never know when it comes to President Lula, and but I think that it gave people a lot to work with. And as I said before, in answering very objectively your question, I think, yeah, it did hijack the substantial agenda. The very fact that I heard like months ago that the task force for fighting hunger and the would be the priority as a legacy for Lula in G20, and the fact that no one talked about it, he didn't give one interview about it this week, is for me a symptom that we have ahead of us a G20 presidency that might be full of very bold and controversial statements. And we may be walking towards a November summit that might be very controversial, especially when it comes to welcoming or not President Putin.
Well, we might have questions from the audience, but I'm unable to see them. So I wonder if you can see them or anybody can see them, because it's not showing here to me. So if we have any questions from the audience, that
I can help you here. I have I can read them in the website. There is one from Professor Nicholas. He's asking, he would like to ask either panelist, which are the risks for Lula's administration to include Ukraine-Russia conflict in the agenda, in the G20 agenda?
Is in the agenda.
Lourival.
Well, he claims that that's not their aim, right? That they would not want it to dominate the agenda, but then came the Gaza war, and so I think these two subjects will be necessarily in the agenda, no matter whether Brazil wants it or not, because it's a worldwide issue, and that's why, by the way, there will be no final statement. It's not possible to conciliate the views of this stuff. Look, in order for President Putin to come to Brazil and not be arrested, Congress has to change the constitution. And that would be very hard, because many jurists would argue that this is an article of the Constitution which cannot be changed unless there is a constitutional assembly. in other words, there has to be a new constitution because this is one of those articles which cannot be changed, which has to do with human rights and the subscription by Brazil to human rights conventions such as the Treaty of Rome, which has created the International Criminal Court, which has added or has a mandate of prison against President Putin for having ordered the kidnapping of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia in order to indoctrinate them, to turn them forcibly against their own country. And nowadays, the teenagers, those Ukrainian kidnapped teenagers, are being trained forcibly to fight against their own country. So for President Lula I don't think Putin can come, just like it happened in South Africa. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa wanted Putin to go, but then the Supreme Court, the government, Congress, everyone told the president that wouldn't be possible. And so he went to Moscow or to St. Petersburg to explain Putin why he could not come, right? But anyways, I think that President Lula is missing a superb opportunity for Brazil to exert leadership in the climate issues, in the energy transition. Brazil has what the whole world needs, which is the forest, which captures carbon, water, clean water, energy, renewable energy, and food. So those four things are what the world most needs. And we could have in the avant-garde of all these issues, our energy matrix is 75%, more than that, 83% clean. The world's is 75% fossil fuels. So it's the opposite. Now, as we say, Brazil, Lula is sidelining all these issues, and this is not talking about poverty issues. President Lula has credentials also in terms of poverty issues, of income transfer program, maybe the biggest in the world, or the most successful in the world. So he would have a lot to roadshow, and he's missing this. After he came to power, Amazon deforestation dropped by more than 60%. This is a tremendous success. It's not easy to do that. It's a very complex environment. So he would have wonderful credentials to galvanize Brazil's position in the world, but he is preferring this track of this geopolitical mining fields, or that he thinks he would propel him to the position of global South leader. I think he's very mistaken, even for his own personal interests.
Well, we are in the last 5 minutes, and we do have a lot of questions. Now, I'm maybe reading all the questions that we have and try to answer in a package. So first of all, there is a question here for those of us who are not following closely. What exactly did Lula say about Gaza? This is one question. The other one, what about climate finance, mobilizing research from the US? There is another question here. How would you characterize Brazil's role regarding implementing of the Barbados agreements going forward? And another question, does this controversial statements of President Lula have a practical effect on cooperation between Brazil and other nations? For example, he criticized the US regarding the Ukrainian war, Ukraine-Russia war. Could this have an impact on Brazil and US partnership? So then, just to answer the first ones, like what Lula said exactly about Gaza. So Lula was, I would just answer that because it's really quick. Lula was a guest invited to attend the African Union Summit in Ethiopia this week. And during a speech there to the press, Lula compared Israel's military campaign in Gaza to the Holocaust. And this generate a wave of reactions and red lines in the international press. So I leave Bruna and Lourival to the next three questions. So climate finance, Barbados Agreement, and the impact of those declarations or Brazilian position and the declaration about Gaza and Brazil overall relations.
Okay, so I think the declaration, I think the statement that Secretary Blinken gave was very blunt and clear and candid. He said, like, we disagree firstly about it, but good friends can disagree. And I think that that's been the message since the UN General Assembly, that Brazil and US will disagree and will be continues this strong partnership in other matters, including climate change, which is the second question here. And about that, I think it's important to mention two things. One is Brazil, through the finance track, is working closely also with the development banks on climate finance. There's a forum happening in São Paulo next week, right before the finance ministers' meetings. There is a task force around it. There's a lot of work being unfolded in different engagement groups involving very serious NGOs and think tanks around the globe, and including the Brazil Institute and the Wilson Center, focusing on that matter. Again, it's been not in the headlines for obvious reasons, which we already discussed, unfortunately, but can be an important legacy that Lula may deliver, that Brazil may deliver under this presidency, and especially when it comes to working with development banks, leveraging and resources for climate and also for the Amazon Fund. During Blinken and Lula meeting, Blinken mentioned the possibility of agreeing to fund with more $45 million, an amount that would still require approval in Congress, at the same thing that with the 500 million, which was pledged and is still depending on approving, which has generated all the amounts discussed by the US for the Amazon Fund has been disappointing to Brazilians from the start, to the Brazilian government. However, this is still something that it's in the bilateral agenda. And it is in the bilateral agenda also for the upcoming spring meetings, as we are also, I think, making this conversation more broadly with other development banks and understanding what are the best practices and how Brazil can contribute through not only BNDES, the development bank, but also mobilizing other resources, not only to the Amazon, but also to other agendas in terms of climate. So this is one thing. The other is, well, I think the second question I already mentioned, that there is like scars that are there still about the remarks that Lula made on Ukraine. I think the remarks that Lula made on Ukraine were much more serious from a US perspective than the ones that happened now about Gaza. But again, those are things that, as we said before, those are mistakes that could be avoided for a much more fruitful and strategic relationship. About Barbados agreement, I want to say that Brazil just nominated a new ambassador to Venezuela, Giovânia Maria de Oliveira, who is a very seasoned ambassador. She presented her credentials to President Maduro. And I think that Brazil's position on that matter is that they would like to see the conflict being solved in the region, and Brazil will continue to continue the dialogue and wants to play a role and not burn any bridges. But the same thing that we said before about Navalny's assassination, and I say again, there are certain things that sometimes it sounds like cognitive dissonance when you don't recognize very obvious things that are already out. It's clear, it's obvious that we expected Brazil to have a more clarity in the statements and not being, as we say in Portuguese, covering the sun with the spots, with a spotted pen, because then it goes through. You see that that's not the clarity. So I think that's something that we should demand more clarity from Brazil's foreign policy and from the president and its diplomats.
Lourival, the multilateral bank meeting coming to Sao Paulo, I think next week, if I'm not wrong. So climate finance also being discussed during G20, right?
That's right. We hope that the focus will be turned to these issues, these substantial issues. There is this $100 billion commitment by the rich countries. This comes from the Paris Agreement to help developing countries finance their climate mitigation and all this, which is clearly not enough. So that's where the multilateral banks should come in and help finance, especially for the poor countries, not necessarily Brazil, but the African countries, South American, some South American, Latin American countries, and Caribbean countries, the island states, which are very much under pressure because of the climate change and all this. So this is an opportunity for Brazil to try to correct its leadership role and try to do something that can really have consequences and positive consequences for the planet.
Well, I think we're in the time, like we arrived to the. So I would like to thank you for sharing this with us today. Thank you for all. Thank you for Bruna and to Lourival to be here with us today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the Lourival Center and the Latin American program and the Brazilian Institute to allow this conversation to happen. See you soon.
Thank you, Luisa. Bye-bye.
Thank you.